I would now like to invite CWR board member Pip Attorney to come and introduce our next speaker for the morning. Our first speaker.
Thanks. Good morning. I have two things in common with this morning's keynote speaker. Dr. Moira McQueen and I both attended the University of Toronto, and we both speak Italian. Moira McQueen began a fascinating journey with a law degree from the University of Glasgow before completing a graduate degree and PhD from the University of Toronto. She has been teaching and researching moral theology since 1994, pursuing bioethical issues such as palliative care, reproductive technology, stem cell experimentation, and mental health, among others. In addressing subjects related to contemporary ethical issues, Dr. McQueen is involved with a wide-ranging audience at parish level, with school boards, healthcare institutions, and as a lecturer at seminars and conferences. In 2014, Pope Francis appointed Dr. McQueen to his International Theological Commission, where she is the sole Canadian member. During an interview on the subject of her appointment to the commission, Dr. McQueen remarked that, despite best efforts, people will write or say something that actually departs from what they meant to say. I believe you, as communicators, will agree that Moira McQueen understands the essence of the work which we do. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Moira McQueen. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. And thank you, Philippa, for introducing me, and thank you to everybody, in fact, in your executive committee for inviting me to come and speak at this conference, which is a newbie for me in terms of speaking at a conference for professional communicators. And so I'm really delighted to be asked to do that, and I know you will bear with my non-professionalism. I'm just a moral theologian, but so it's a little bit different. And welcome to Canada, and especially welcome to beautiful Niagara Falls. That whole idea of having, one of God's most beautiful gifts of nature right in front of our eyes to really celebrate his whole creation. And I'm also very excited to be talking because I think that Sister Anne Consuela is watching me from heaven, because I am a convent-educated high school girl, and I was taught by the Sisters of Notre Dame de Namur. I don't know if there's MD here from that particular congregation. And we went to high school when we were 11, going on 12, so we're a bit younger in terms of when we started secondary. And I remember in my first year high school, so I would be about 12, 3 of us were doing an impromptu can-can on top of the desks. And who should walk in but Sister Anne Consuela, who was our French teacher. And she said, "Go home and tell your parents that Sister Anne Consuela said you are all hooligans of the first degree." Needless to say, none of us told our parents. But she was a wonderful teacher, I have to say that. And many people talk about their convent high school education as a problem. Mary McCarthy, all the people who've written about that episode in their lives. And while I was far from a model student, I was always a little bit of a tomboy, you might say. I mean, most people do not do can-cans on the top of the desk, especially when they know somebody might walk in. So, but at the same time, I was really grateful for that whole episode in my life and still feel very much attached to that particular congregation. So I'm always amazed, and I know several women in particular religious, that the efforts they make, the tasks they undertake, as Bishop Burgess said in his very inspirational talk, their versatility, and especially how they never seem to retire. And they always seem to me ageless. It's really, you really are in so many ways God's gift to not just the church, but also to our much wider community. So I have to talk, and my topic is Catholic social teaching and communication. I think that's what it is. That's a good start. Now, I know you're never supposed to start with an apology, but that's exactly what I'm going to do. Because I told my husband when I was talking with people about even the title, and this is what it emerged as, and I showed it to my husband, and he said, "My God, Moira, that's a boring title, you know." Thank you very much for the vote of confidence, right? So I thought, okay, maybe that is not how to communicate. Maybe, you see, because I'm not a professional communicator. I go into class, okay, class, today we're talking about gender dysphoria, or today, class, we'll be talking about indissolubility of marriage, or whatever it is, and that's it, you know. And I don't think about making it more attractive or maybe more engaging. And this has been a very useful exercise in letting me know myself about how I could improve my communications, because I communicate as a teacher, not professionally as you do, but it's still communication, and it's been an object lesson for me. I know if you put Catholic in the title, it's okay. If you put social in the title, it's okay. If you put teaching, everybody's eyes glaze over. So, you know, I could have called it The Joy of the Gospel, Food for a Hungry World. Or I could have called it Pope Francis and the New Wave of Evangelization because of the one current. I could have thought of many things, but I thought of them too late to send in for today. Okay, so, as I said, please bear with me. I just want to tell you a little bit about myself, just from the point of view of who I am as a family member. So this was at the wedding of our younger daughter. We have 7 children, Matt and I. And so Alison is the one with the red tartan sash. It's the McQueen tartan, so that's courtesy of her father's side of the family. And so everybody in this picture, from the little guy who's scratching his head in the front row, along to this one at this end, and from my daughter in the back along there, that's all my clan. So there's about 23, or they weren't all there, but there's about 23 or 24 of us when we all get together. And so that was a very happy occasion just 2 years ago, and now they have a little boy, Owen, so now we have 10 grandchildren. So as you can imagine, it's quite hectic keeping up with them, and it's also very challenging. And even at that level, there is the question of communications, and I'm very aware of that, not just about Catholic social teaching, of course, but just in general. This picture is a little bit blurry, and anyway, I think you can make out who the person in green is. And I just want to say that I'm very proud of this picture, not in a proud, boastful way, but it was taken at the Second Synod on Marriage and the Family, and I was privileged to attend that. I was even more privileged to be asked to do the first reading at the liturgy. But I'm really using the photograph to show that even photographs can distort the reality of the actual situation. Because I'm sure you've all been in St. Peter's, and if you've been at one of the liturgies there, then the lectern is away over here on the right-hand side of the altar, and the Pope, of course, is sitting up very high in the main altar, so I was very, very far away from him, and definitively not in front of him, the way the photograph shows. So I'm not sending that to him, I don't want him to know. So actually what I thought I would focus on is a little bit more on Pope Francis and his method and style and communications, because it has been such a breath of fresh air, such a difference in general. Which is not to say, of course, that our previous popes didn't communicate, but every pope has his particular charism, and Pope Francis speaks to us, I think, in a different way. And he has changed things even at the professional communications level in the Vatican. So he formed the new dicastery and called, before it was the Pontifical Council for Social Communications, all these ones that are listed were all somewhat separate, but now all come together in this particular communication setup. So from his motu proprio, he was saying that these bodies from the date of the proprio would continue their activities, but now they would be all under the Secretariat for Communications. So it was a kind of one voice approach again, much like the theme of your conference, that would bring people together with a little bit more oversight perhaps than had been before. And so this is what would actually happen, that it would, with the Secretariat of State, so therefore now with Cardinal Parolin as working with him, but making sure that everything squared with what's actually issued from the Secretariat of State as well, and that this new dicastery would take over responsibility for the Holy See's institutional website, and very important these days, and I think this is fascinating, the Twitter service of the Supreme Pontiff, which I'm sure everybody in this room probably follows. And so Pope Francis is completely up to date in terms of how he communicates with the world. And that this would begin in June of last year. And so all the different areas, as you know, I mean, they're very, very important in the Catholic world in maintaining that one voice at this kind of official level. So the Holy See Press Office still doing what it was doing before in terms of that distribution of official communications, but now also tied in with the Secretariat of State because of this particular need for oversight. And then many of you have probably been involved, perhaps in Rome, at press conferences and briefings and giving official responses. And of course, again, it's added several times, so I think we're supposed to take a message from it, that the dicastery also must consult the Secretariat of State. I think sometimes myself, when Pope Francis talks off the cuff on airplanes and other places and gives all these people heart attacks as to how they're supposed to cope with, what he's saying, and the theological arguments as to whether what he's saying there count as magisterial teaching or not, because there's an argument about that too. It's a very tough job, I would imagine, depending on the pontiff, and I think he keeps these people on the run. So the new head is Monsignor Dario Vigano, and he was the former head of Vatican Television. And the Pope is saying here, what I know all of you are already putting into practice, and Bishop Bergi also is saying this, that, and the Pope is talking now about our digital culture, but the new media must become a primary platform for spreading the gospel, for spreading the word which is what the rest of us are building our lives on, the word of Jesus Christ, so for spreading the gospel. So this new Secretariat for Communication is talking about, again, from the Pope to the Secretariat, he's really talking about how digital culture has this capacity really to reach the hearts and the minds of everybody in the world. And he is saying that it's something very close to his heart. So it's an amazing endorsement of the communications work that you're involved in. Oh, I don't know what I did. Oh. This is where I could use a song from Barry Manilow. Or anybody for that matter. All right, sorry. Here we go. So when I said that I would just as soon talk about Pope Francis, it's not that I don't want to talk about Catholic social teaching. I'm assuming, although people say never assume, but I am quite confidently assuming, especially from the work that women religious do, that everybody here is very familiar with Catholic social teaching. So I was really looking at it more from the point of view of how Catholic social teaching is disseminated, and especially by Pope Francis, rather than going into any specific areas in that teaching. So Pope Francis himself, as communicator, we know this is what he does. He has these homilies from Santa Marta just about every day of the week, which is quite incredible in terms of output from him directly. And of course, they're mediated and everybody can read them. And he also appears at the Sunday Angelus, as previous popes have done. And it's always amazing to me how many people are there. I tend to watch it on Sundays, or after Sunday if I can't manage it. The crowds, it's just amazing. The eagerness with which people are waiting to hear his message. And he does, of course, his weekly audience. So here's somebody who has daily and weekly impact on the whole world, and it's through the media that it's able to be done, able to be transmitted. So his own way of communicating, I mentioned the airplane interviews, but also that use of internet, again, especially the Twitter feed, that direct and very short. I use it myself, I find it, I don't do Facebook. Many people do, of course, and it's not that there's anything wrong with it, but it just takes too long as far as I'm concerned. And I find that Twitter is very, very helpful in helping us to sort of really sharpen the message, to really drag out what's really important to be communicated. It's very fast, it's very easy. And all of us we follow different people. I find if I do that first thing in the morning, at least not first thing in the morning at home, first thing in the morning in the office, then I'm able to sort of see very quickly what the very important information, and I'm mainly looking at news from the Catholic world. I don't mean I'm looking at it in terms of looking at presidential or prime ministerial. Twitter is quite the same way, but just in terms of the Catholic world. And so he has this capacity for, this is Pope Francis, of course, the availability of his message to us is pretty constant. And it's, to me, this is something so different. Before, long before, maybe 20, 30 years ago, every time I wanted to find out something that had been said in Rome, I had to go to a library. I would have to get out L'Osservatore Romano and actually see what was being said. To look up encyclicals, to look up everything in the libraries. And it's now amazing to me that in a very short period of time, all this information is instantly available to anybody who has access. And that is, of course, so many people in this day and age. And so that whole question of taking advantage of it is obviously dawned in the Vatican long before many other people, because it seems to me that their system of communication, their systems of communication are excellent, and they know that and they take advantage of it. At the same time, though, although he is stressing that the digital culture is very close to his heart, he is also stressing the need for face-to-face encounter. He is going back to what we already know in that sense, don't go too far with relying only on media to transmit the message of the gospel. This idea of encountering everybody that we meet in everyday life is fundamental, because that's what most of us are doing all the time. Another word that's appears very often, and the Pope puts into practice, is again something really essential for good communications, and that is communicating through dialogue. And in terms of actually modeling that himself, he has formed more committees at the Vatican. So he formed the Council of Cardinals. I can't remember how many cardinals are on it. 9, is it 9? And thank you. And the Council for Finance. So he's consulting at that very senior level in taking advice from the Council for Cardinals at many different levels, and then with all the questions about finance that have been troubling the church, not only the church over the decades, but trying to make everything more transparent, more available, all those words that we use all the time as well. He actually did that in the Vatican, And it seems to be, and I don't obviously understand the workings of the Curia, but there always seems, when there's anything new, and not just in our church, there's a certain resistance to change, etc. So I think he's modeling what can be done, and he has done it. And then, of course, he has formed many more committees to do with the social, not the social teaching of the church, but more the social practice of the church. And I know many women religious groups are really taking part in these areas. And just to mention a few, the committees that he set up to deal with abuse, the terrible problem of abuse, and some of the, you will know about some of the problems even surrounding that committee, which shows it's not, committees don't solve everything, but they're a way of beginning to deal with very serious problems. And the whole question of trafficking, which is just beginning to become, reaching more people's level of awareness in this country, in Canada, and in many other countries. Although the statistics have been available for quite some time, although there has been quite a lot of work done politically for quite some time. I teach a course in Catholic social teaching as part of my overall ethics, and one of the areas that we've been concentrating on for maybe 10 years is in trafficking. And I can tell you that any student who comes in who begins to see the statistics is absolutely amazed at what's going on in that world. And I really credit Pope Francis for raising awareness in that particular issue. I know it's one among many. There are obviously lots of social, truly social, political problems, but he really has raised awareness of that with the Santa Marta group that he has started to try to deal with it from the Catholic Church's point of view at a higher level, a more intense level. And also what the work he has done with refugees, which is an ongoing work, but again, media has really helped to show all of us the plight of people like that in the way that never could have been done before. And he has gone obviously beyond that in doing concrete measures in helping. Something else that I think he models the necessity for dialogue through is his presence at synods. As I said, I was at the second synod in the family, so I've only ever been to one. And it was a wonderful experience because we were there for 3 weeks. And you're there from 9 till 1 and then 4 till 7, something like that, every day. And so the work is as intense as it's meant to be. You're there to work. But the Pope was there every single day except for one Wednesday morning when he had to go to the audience. And all those hours, he sat at a desk in the front and he listened. He didn't ever intervene. He didn't ever stop and say, make a point. Whether he liked it or didn't like it or anything like that, he was there to listen. And I don't know about you, but if you're a class that lasts for 2 hours, by the end of the second hour, you're pretty wiped out. It's probably easier to teach it than to listen to it. I know that, but it's a long time. And these are much longer stretches, and he just listened the whole time. I've never seen anything like it. But it was, and although at one level you would say, okay, well, he wasn't dialoguing, but it was in the cause of dialogue because he is so certain all the time that part of dialogue, of course, is not the actual speaking part of that word, but the listening, which is probably even more important, and which is what most of us find, certainly myself for one, I find that much harder to do. So that was, to me, a personal witness of how to absorb information, which he was then gathering, and then it came out in his exhortation, Amoris Laetitia, not long after the synod itself. So, of course, with Pope Francis, and Bishop Bergi was also talking about discernment and integration, and he talks accompaniment, as we all know, just about all the time, but always tempered with mercy as the key to, I think, his whole papacy, and that whole element of joy. Joy should be in capital letters too, I don't know why not. How else does he communicate? Well, he communicates through his own writings. So the encyclical Evangelii Gaudium And so just this one section from it is where he talks to us in terms of another way of communicating is this idea of encountering people face to face. And so he says the gospel tells us constantly that we have to run the risk. So he's acknowledging this is not always an easy thing to do, far from it, because it means an acceptance and a disclosure of ourselves and listening to the other person's disclosure when we're talking at a more deep level. So that idea, and he even talks about with their physical presence, which challenges us. And again, it brings to mind to me the way when people have some kind of health problem and they're ranged in front of him and sitting in wheelchairs and the elderly, that's where he goes to first. And any pictures any photographs we've ever seen of him, his face seems to light up when he's dealing with that kind of encounter. I think it's a witness to us again. Again, it certainly is to me. But, with their pain and their pleas, he's a beautiful writer as well, in terms of just actual communication at that level. But of course, it's the meaning of what he's saying that's the real test for us. So he communicates through his encyclicals and through his exhortations and through, so far, well, I think there's 2 books. So Evangelii Gaudium, the joy of the gospel, Laudato Si, so praise be the Lord, really. Amoris Laetitia, so the joy or the happiness of love. Even in his titles, he's pointing us towards how we can be refreshed in the Word, where we are really taking our strengths from, and then his very famous book. Again, as I said, we know that mercy is this kind of key to his pontificate. The name of the Lord is mercy. So all these words, to me the message is just so loud and clear in terms of what he's trying to get across. He says so often, and I think I have it in another slide, and he's usually talking, if you'll excuse me, Bishop Bergy, but 2 bishops, and he would say it's not about just trotting out doctrines. It's about this whole idea of speaking from the heart, speaking the word, and dealing with people through dialogue, and very much this actual personal encounter. So his own impact in communicating, I think, again, this is why so many people in the world react so positively to him, because he does have that charism. And so that is a gift of the Spirit. So it's something that's badly needed in the world, that he is so highly personable in himself. That's an individual charism, and we're all made as whiners or winners. That's absolutely true. Or we let ourselves be that way, however it works. And he has been very honest in terms of his own personal development, how he talked just recently about how at a certain stage in his life he actually did go for some psychological counseling. He doesn't say what it was for, and nor does he need to. Just the very fact that he actually says it is another invitation to many of us to be able to be open about those times in our lives when we actually do need people, when an encounter would be valuable for us. So it's not just about us being the people who encounter, we also need to be the people who are encountered, because every one of us has needs, maybe lots of the time. And so this idea of there's a certain anticipation, I think especially from the secular media, as to what he's going to say next. Because he doesn't disappoint, let's say. He always has something very on target to say. I just call him the Pope of Surprises. And although he's very clearly Jesuit in his formation, and especially, you might say, with his emphasis on discernment, but he is so Franciscan at the same time in his joyfulness. And in fact, those particular virtues, those particular habits in the true sense of the word, they may be stressed in different religious communities, but clearly they're truly universal as well, applicable actually to all of us in our human nature, but especially perhaps to us as Catholics when we're looking at helps in the encounter and how we can actually develop ourselves. So I'm just totally boastful today in using 2 photographs. And so, and again, I'm not proud of it, but I love it. It's more just coming from the heart. And so this was at the synod, and there's just a little story around this one, which is really, kind of strange. So I said that the synod is in 2 parts. The meetings at the synod are in 2 parts. So there's quite a gap in the afternoon. The way people in Rome do this is very wise. I wish they did it here, really, 2.5, 3 hours or something. Some people sleep, some people gad around, etc., depending on your personality. The person in the middle with me, her name is Sharon, and she's from New Zealand, and she and I were in the same small groups at the synod. And so we were coming back in to get ready for the 4 o'clock session. We had been out in the afternoon. The day before this day, it had been raining in Rome, and the shoes I had with me let in some rain, so never one to say no to the need for a new pair of shoes. The next day I said, okay, I have to go and buy a new pair of shoes because, it was still raining. And so Sharon said, oh, I'll come with you then, and she's a gelato, fiend, and she knows all the good gelato shops in Rome. And I'm quite willing to join with her. When we were coming back, and you can't see it, my left hand is way down here. I'm actually carrying a plastic bag with a pair of shoes in it. Go figure, talk about, formal pictures. Anyway, Sharon said to me, everybody here this was the 3rd week, nearly everybody at the synod, there were 54 lay people. They've all met the Pope, and some of them were Spanish speaking naturally, and they would go up and just talk to him, or if they were Italian, they would talk to him. And she and I were not too pushy enough, but she hadn't gone forward to meet him anyway, and I had said, oh, you'll meet him, you will meet him, eventually it will happen. So you can just see, this is a long story, I'm sorry, I never talk in sound bites. I'll never be a professional communicator. You can maybe see the little row of bishops behind. And those bishops, when we sort of came in the front door, one of the people were in our small group, and we said, why are you all lined up? And he said, well, we have a small presentation to make to the Holy Father. So, and then we saw the Holy Father coming up from Santa Marta towards, the hall here. And so I said to Sharon, you know what? If we stand behind this row of bishops, not too obtrusively, but just so we're within eye shot, he'll maybe see us and maybe he'll come over. And she said, okay. So believe it or not, that's actually what happened. So the 6 of them made their lovely presentation, and I think it was, and he talked to them, and then he just came round the corner. So you can see Sharon in the middle, star-struck teenager, celebrity. But that's the effect that I think the Pope has on just about everybody. And I'm just as bad, grinning like a... But I tell people this, apart from the shoebox, we had just had gelato. And we were just coming back in to get ready for the session, and the plan was to go downstairs, wash our hands, brush your hair, all the usual sort of stuff. But we met the Pope before that, so I'm actually sort of saying, oh, lovely to meet you, I hope my hand doesn't... But he just beams like that at everybody. Bishop Berger, you met him at the Ad Limina. Many people here have, I don't understand his capacity for always being genial and congenial, really. To me, it's a gift. I mean, most of us can be like that a lot of the time, but he seems to be like that all of the time. When he's meeting people, and he does make you feel. He concentrates on, he makes eye contact, all the things that, people talk about, and it's really quite remarkable. All right, too busy talking together. All right. So that's what I'm saying here, that whole question of people as communicators and how I am looking at him as a model of communication in his own person, in his style, in his directness, and his friendliness, that joyfulness. But I did notice, and many of you probably did too, that when he's meeting with heads of state or senior politicians, prime ministers, presidents, that kind of thing, he doesn't smile in official photographs. And in the tablet, the English journal, the tablet, I read an explanation for that is that he doesn't, this is a political maneuver, he doesn't want to be seen as endorsing any of those particular politicians and particular programs or policies, politics. And that makes perfect sense. So it's not that he disapproves of the Prime Minister of the UK or anything like that. It's just that that's the way they handle it. So it's another example to me of what you're communicating and actually being very prudent about how you communicate to. Oh, I don't know, I keep jumping here. I think it's really interesting too at the same time that he is not afraid of being a little bit more strict and, the word I use here, direct and corrective. He has very harsh words sometimes for people whose platforms are maybe holding other people back. And I think this is perfectly in line with being a joyful personality who's encountering people and being in dialogue, because that does not mean we have to be nicey-nicey and politically correct. It means that when the truth has to be stated, the truth has to be stated, and granted there are ways of stating the truth, but there are some situations where the truth cannot really be sugar-coated. And so this is, again, to me, another way in which he really helps us in how he communicates. And it makes me think of, the gospel words, "Woe to you, you scribes and Pharisees." When Jesus was throwing over tables in the temple too, when the moneylenders were involved, he was angry. And we, of course, not just in moral theology, make the distinction between justifiable anger when you are supposed to be angry, and sort of non-virtuous anger when it's just coming out of a defect in our personality, So when the words are needed, they also have to be said. And Jesus, in fact, to me, is prime communicator. It seems very much to me that Francis is following in those footsteps. I called this one the Christmas gift to the Curia, but you probably remember reading about how the cardinals were all, the curial cardinals and staff were assembled for a Christmas meeting with him. I think it was the year before last. And expecting, as when we all have Christmas parties, everything's, this is a very happy time of year and we're all full of goodwill towards men and women too. And instead what he did was he reamed them out. There had been many things that were going wrong, and he took that opportunity to, used it as a corrective and directive. And, I just remember reading the reports afterwards that some of the cardinals were sort of stunned, instead of Happy Christmas or whatever they say in Rome. It was, a lesson to get out there and start doing the work that was needing to be done. So, quite amazing. So he admonishes the clergy fairly regularly, if you follow what he says. There are certain things that he finds totally contradictory to the priesthood and religious life as well, but he seems to speak more to the priesthood. About the fancy vestments, his annoyance at too much lace, their theology, and of course this isn't all clergy. I clearly understand that, very far from it. But again, he doesn't treat everybody the same. He makes the distinctions when the distinctions need to be made. And especially since he does talk about the smell of the sheep, he's sort of pointing out to them, and actually to us as well, of course, that we're just not sheepish enough in the sense that he means it. And of course, he's, as usual, correct. When he's talking about social justice issues, I think it's, again, this personal example. So he doesn't just talk doctrine. The doctrines are assumed, but he models it, again, through his personal examples. And we're aware of that he doesn't take off, and there's nothing wrong with going across to Castel Gandolfo to escape the heat and taking summer off. I mean, especially at the age of some of our popes, and this isn't ageism, but they work so hard and they clearly have not retired or anything like that, that a summer break, most of us are very, very careful of our time, and rightly so. I mean, we need to stay healthy, we need to stay, able to deal with the rest of the year, but he said he wasn't going to do that. I think this year it said he took 2 weeks. He stayed in Santa Marta. He's traveling all the time, of course, but it's not for vacation. So he had 2 weeks just, and probably he was, on retreat or something like that during that time. It really scales it back as far as many of us are concerned. And clearly, too, he cut back on trappings. Remember the episode of the shoes when he wouldn't wear the red shoes, cardinal shoes, and just wanted to wear his plain black ones from Buenos Aires. And when he went to the States, he didn't want a big fancy limousine when he made the visit, and not just the States, I only read about it when he went there. And his own little car was taken so he could drive around in his little car. And the whole question of vestments. So cutting back on the trappings. In other words, I think he's saying, could we please concentrate on substance? And the style part is okay, but please more of substance. And in Laudato Si', which I guess from the point of view of his social teachings, then the whole emphasis on not just ecology, but human ecology, the way Pope Benedict had said before him, because they're inextricably linked in any event, right? So while he's talking, if you've read that encyclical, you know there are many very intense and challenging and deep passages, sections in that encyclical. I mean, it really is a challenging to us encyclical and a challenge for us. But at the same time, he scales it down and talks about the small challenges. I mean, I have never, ever read an encyclical where a pope would mention things like, well, you could turn down the electricity and you could wear an extra sweater, I mean, it's just it's not the sublime to the ridiculous. It's actually encompassing all the dimensions, big and small, where everybody can make a difference. So it's a very different style. Oh my goodness. And then he also communicates social justice issues through his own home at St. Peter's. So watching some of the things that he's done, installing showers at St. Peter's for homeless people. It's small in one way, it's massive in another. His visits to Lampedusa, the island, the little island just off the coast of Italy, where most of the refugee boats were coming across from North Africa, and the terrible tragedies that we were witnessing as to the fate of those, the capsized boats, the number of people arriving on the shores there, and he actually went there himself to console, welcome, whatever words one would actually use there, but again, raising awareness of how we are to treat refugees. And again, this is another area where women religious are very heavily involved globally. And he himself brought back a couple of refugee families, I think it was 14 people from Syria when he visited there. Again, I think it's a very clear pointer to everybody else what we could do. And at much more local level, washing prisoners' feet, washing women's feet. Remember the hoo-ha because he was washing women's feet. It was actually easier when he washed prisoners' feet, canonically. So, I mean, sorry, Bishop Burge is a canon lawyer. But it's a very, very interesting approach that he takes. Nobody is excluded. Everybody is welcome. It's quite amazing. And he visits the sick and the elderly and all sorts of hospitals and things. I think he makes a point of making a visit once a week or once a month. I don't know if it's scheduled or otherwise, but just last Friday, that's what he was doing. He was in a senior citizens at a rehab center just outside Rome, and the cameras just caught him talking with all the people, blessing them, hugging them, all that sort of thing. And I think this a lot. If the Pope can find the time to do those sorts of personal encounters, then the message again to us that he's conveying, the message that he's communicating, I think is very, very clear. When it comes to politics, of course, the Vatican is a city-state and highly political too, as we know, with representatives at the UN, all sorts of things like that. But he's very often visited countries that have real problems, although he's been advised sometimes not to because of the dangers to his own person, if you like, too. So the Central African Republic and more recently Colombia, many places that are are problematic for high-profile people to visit, but he does it. And when he visited the US Congress, I know people there, and not just politicians, were pretty anxious about what the Pope was going to say to them, probably in light of his encyclicals, in light of the challenges that he makes to all of us. But in fact, he didn't chasten them. This was, again, probably to many of us, another lesson in how to dialogue, how to encounter, and not back down at the same time, just his particular way of being positive. And I thought it was a wonderful way of engaging Congress in terms of encouraging Americans in general to retrieve their foundational principles, the principles in which that country was based upon. I mean, there's these very important principles of freedom and justice, and that whole question of the restoration of hope and righting wrongs. And I'm sure you watched it, most of you, and it was just an amazing speech. When he spoke to Congress, he talked, the first part there is actually what he said about moving forward together in a spirit of fraternity and solidarity. You might think you would expect him to say something like that, but he brought in Catholic social teaching. It's more than Catholic social teaching, it's Catholic teaching, that we are to be looking after the individual and the common good, and so he stressed that particular note. And then I thought this was brilliant from the point of view of PR, but much deeper than that at a spiritual level, so both if you like, that he reminded people, the Americans in particular, of their own important, heroic figures, using Abraham Lincoln, of course, and Martin Luther King, and Dorothy Day, and Thomas Merton. And so I don't know about you, but when I heard him actually say that live, it was, you really hit the targets. Dorothy Day, so I mean, he covered so much. He covered it from the point of view of ethnicity, he covered it from the point of view of woman, man, he covered it from the point of view of not Catholic. I mean, everything, but these are the people, so it's nothing to do with religion in a sense. It has a lot to do with religion, but not per se. These are the people who are really upholding these foundational principles and working for social justice. So when he communicates, I don't know why it jumps, sorry. When he communicates with bishops generally about, again, communicating the good news, this is where he very often, he was talking to the US bishops, granted, in his talk to them, but I think it's obviously, you can apply it universally into bishops in other countries, and not just them, but especially them, because the bishops are teachers, pastors in our church. They're the primary teachers. And so the Pope is saying, the first message should not be about complicated doctrines. It should be about joyfully proclaiming Christ. And I think, again, this makes sense, because that's what we're about, first and foremost, Christ as original communicator long before the digital age and long after the digital age towards whatever is going to happen next. And he reminded them that their flocks, his words, should encounter in the heart of their pastor that taste of eternity which they actually seek. I chose seek this morning, by the way, for one of my 4 words, but I didn't really have that in mind, maybe subconsciously. Communicating with the faithful in general on the good news, Laudato Si, I think, in my book, has it all. It's the most, don't want to say happy, it sounds a bit Pollyannish, but the most joyful in spiritual sense of, I think, just about any encyclical I've ever read. And it really is based, again, if you've read it, on our need to look after the world, our need to look after creation. It takes me right back to Genesis and the way God formed the earth and us as humans in it, and our need for the earth and clearly the earth's need in so many ways for us. So it's not new, but he does re-emphasize the whole question of our social responsibility and our need to be following Catholic social teaching. And he urges us to leave our silos. Again, it's another agricultural metaphor in many ways, and also very scriptural, of course, too, about storing up grain in our silos and then not being ready when the challenge comes. So get out of those silos and participate. And he emphasized, of course, again, always, I don't think he ever says anything without emphasizing the need for mercy. So for professional communicators, I'm sure you all read the message that comes out every year that's aimed at you, for you. And so this one, the 48th one, I think this was 2014. To be honest, I hadn't always read them before myself, so you can see why it's really interesting when you start looking into other people's worlds and how they operate and what they're looking at, that then you begin to be more educated yourself in terms of what's being said and how we could follow as non-professional communicators, but the advice that we get to do so. So he talked there, and it was interesting that he used the word walls, and that was long before the presidential election, if it was 2014. But he did talk about that walls which divide are broken down if we're prepared to listen and learn from each other. So again, his emphasis on dialogue. And he talks there in that message too, uses his, the same themes come up naturally time after time. So a culture of encounter demands giving and receiving, as I mentioned before. And of course, media, I shouldn't even say it can help, media is what does it through the networks of communication. And this quote from him in that particular message, I think, goes to the heart of the matter. It's tremendously encouraging for communicators, I think. Of course, there's abuse and use possible with any kind of technology, but he's looking at the internet here as very positive in terms of at least offering possibilities for these encounters and solidarity. He said, this is something truly good, a gift from God. And I don't think we hear too many people say that about the possibilities of the internet, even given all the problems that can also arise from the abuse of it. But just again, the Pope is concentrating on what's possible, and that, of course, would be our focus too. He warns us, and he is not just to professional communicators, I think this applies to just about all of us in daily life. 20 years ago, if I was teaching a class, the students would be sitting just, talking, dialoguing, looking at the professor, whatever. Now when you go into a classroom, everybody has a computer screen in front of them, and you hope they're busy typing down what you're saying, but, everybody's had their little, side trips onto different things. But it's just very interesting. This is part of the digital culture, and we don't think it's unusual. But he's using that again, I think, as a metaphor about not hiding behind screens, and behind screens of all sorts. So that, of course, is a problem in terms of dialogue and encounter if we don't get ourselves out of those silos again. This time he's talking about hiding behind screens. And all of us do that. Words, I'm doing it right now, lectures. We're all very, very busy people. It goes with the task, it goes with the job, it goes with what we want to do. It actually goes with our vocations in life. If we weren't busy, we would be thinking there was something we weren't doing, etc. So it's a good thing to be busy, but not to the extent of using it as an excuse for ignoring those around us in terms of actual encounter. I know I've found that myself. You're busy typing up something that's incredibly important to you, and there's a knock at the door. Do I get up always and say, oh, hi, Yeah, I do by the time I've come around the corner, maybe. But my first reaction very often is, oh, no, I want to get this done. Here's somebody else coming along. I have to pay attention, etc. And again, it's very human to do that, especially if you have a deadline, but it can become an excuse in other situations as well. So I think he's trying to point us to the idea that we should always be ready, and especially in these kind of fields where we're talking about proclaiming the word as the foundation of our vocation, we should be ready for face-to-face encounters. And that is how the gospel is spread. So I'm nearly there, you'll be happy to know. This was also from the 48th World Communications Day message. And he asked this question, and it was an interesting use of a word: how can we be neighborly in our use of communications media and this new environment? And he answers that by saying, as soon as you see the word neighborly, end of day Catholic is going to think of the Good Samaritan, and that's what he's setting us up for. And I think this is a wonderful proclamation aimed at professional communicators. You know, you are Good Samaritans, and those who communicate, in effect, become your neighbors, making us all children of God. So, last slide, just to sum up a little bit in terms of what I'm now calling the wisdom of Pope Francis in terms of his writings, his personal example, his preachings through his homilies, audiences, etc., his talks on airplanes, his talks to foreign governments, his talks to the US Congress, how he models the whole question of face-to-face encounter and encourages us to do the same, and at the same time using media to the highest degree possible for benefit. So he says it's not enough to be passers-by on the digital highway. I think his metaphors are wonderful, the way he moves from silos to digital highways, but we can visualize this. So it's not enough to be passers-by, but these connections need to grow into true encounters, and true encounters mostly are face-to-face. So there's the need, it's a both and, it's never an either or. The media absolutely necessary. And he ends up by saying that the digital highway is a street where people can actually live and can be reached. So I just would like to finish on his words, because I have found them very useful just personally in sort of looking for material. And I said, oh my God, how am I going to address professional communicators? And it made me seek. It made me search. And I think there is a call for sure in this. And I can't remember the fourth part of that particular quartet this morning. But thank you very much. And I do wish you every blessing in all the professional and personal work that you do for yourselves and for the church and for the neighbors that you meet every single day.
Thank you, Dr. McQueen. We have a small token of thanks, but I'll bring that down. We deliver here. We're very helpful that way. I want to thank you very much for your words this morning, for being with us. Do we have time? Are there any questions? We have a little bit of time before we need to stop for break, if you're open to that. If there are any questions for Dr. McQueen or any discussion. All right, you people know how this works. Once you're done, we're not going to ask you more questions. All right. In that case, we're in line for a 15-minute break. So please visit with the exhibitors. And there's the coffee and water refresh. If you could please be back here. What? Oh, I'm getting a sign. All right, hold on. Talk amongst yourselves. Don't go anywhere yet. Okay, sorry, the error was on my part. The break is until 10:30, so you have some time. Yeah, please visit the exhibitors, and we'll give you some time to do that and visit with one another, and we'll start back at the next session at 10:30.